Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 21. Today we are picking up where we left off from class on Thursday of last week, talking about public order and victimless crimes. And today we're going to talk specifically about disorder and the link between disorder and crime. So I'm going to start out by talking to you about an experiment that happened in 1969 that really kicked off interest in the study of disorder and its link to criminal behavior. So in 1969, a researcher named Philip Zimbardo, psychology professor at Stanford, and his graduate students decided to conduct a social experiment. Some of you might recognize the name Zimbardo from the famous prison experiment that he also conducted at Stanford in the 1960s. But he did other things, and the study that we're going to talk about today is something that has been at least thought of as being one of the major influences behind studying how place and how disorderly places matter. So essentially what he did in 1969 is he picked two locations. And the first location that he picked was the Bronx in New York. Specifically, he picked an especially rundown area that he describes in his paper as a ghetto area of the Bronx in New York. So that was location one. And the second location that he picked for his experiment was Palo Alto, California. For those of you who don't know, that's a fairly affluent area right around in the surrounding area of Stanford University, where he taught. So what he did is he and his grad students placed a 1959 Oldsmobile in each of these two locations. Now, remember, 1969, this is, at the time, not that old of a car. Brand new, perfect condition, 1959 Oldsmobiles placed in both of these two locations. So, what I want you guys to think about is, what do you think happened to this car over the course of, say, the week after they placed it in these two different neighborhoods? Would it be your prediction that the car that got placed in the Bronx after left for a few days would get vandalized more quickly than the one in Palo Alto? Why do you think that might be? Because that's what most people tend to predict who haven't seen the experiment before. And essentially what we know happened in this experiment is within about 3 days in the Bronx, the car that was left there was completely stripped of its useful parts. It was vandalized and ruined. However, the car in Palo Alto was not. So 3 days of the car just sitting there, the car in Palo Alto was not damaged, the car in the Bronx was. But after over a week without the Palo Alto car being touched, Zimbardo and his grad students went back to Palo Alto, back to that car, and smashed one window with a sledgehammer. According to him, after they did this, after they smashed the initial window, passersby started to join in after a while, damaging and vandalizing the car until it was just as demolished as the car had been that was left in the Bronx. So the point of this study, and the point that, the reason that we're talking about it, the reason that it kicks off this class, is what he tried to show was that signs of disorder may actually trigger and cause or indirectly lead to crime. In other words, in a fairly organized, well-monitored, cared about community like Palo Alto, all it takes is one person to kind of initially chip away at that appearance for more people to jump in and do the same. So this study, this Zimbardo experiment, eventually influenced writers throughout criminology, but particularly writers of a theory that was called broken windows theory, which was your reading for today. And what this theory is really interested in is talking about these lower level kind of disorderly public order style offenses. And what people who are interested in this try to show often is that public order crimes like this, vandalizing a car, are inextricably linked to not only the amount of crime in an area, but the amount of law enforcement at a local day-to-day level. But before we really get into the theory, I want to give you some context to understand what policing was like in this era, its goals, its expectations of officers, and why it might have been that in the past couple decades we moved away from different eras of policing and started to focus more and be more interested on incidents of disorder. So let's talk a little bit about what policing was like for the better part of the 20th century. From about the 1930s to the 1980s, scholars have shown that we were in an era that they call the professional policing era. What they mean by that is, during this era, we had come out of a time period in the United States where the idea of the police were thought to be very corrupt. They were thought to be fairly inefficient, very technologically behind. Leading in the late 1800s, early 1900s, police officers were for the most part appointed by local aldermen in their area. It was a very political, very disorganized body. It wasn't the kind of model that you guys have grown up with and are accustomed to today. And the pioneer of a movement to change all that, to move us out of this kind of corrupt political era, was a police chief who became the commissioner in Berkeley, California, by the name of August Vollmer. So Vollmer was someone who not only studied and was interested in learning about criminal behavior, but also was a chief of police. He was also very entrenched in the day-to-day activities of policing. And he was someone who felt very strongly, this was in the 1930s, that we needed to move away from business as usual and move into what he called a professional model. So he designed this professional policing model that became incredibly popular and got used for the majority of the 20th century. Some people would argue that many places still operate under this basic model. And there were three basic goals that Vollmer was incredibly interested in to develop and advance police departments. First of all, he was very passionate about the fact that police officers should be extremely educated, much more educated than they were in the early 20th century. It used to be the case that with very little education, certainly not a high school degree, you could become a police officer as long as you kind of knew the right people. Vollmer was one of the first people to establish a criminology program at a university, Berkeley specifically. And he really believed that if we're going to have police officers that the public will trust and will be able to be the most efficient, they need to be educated not only in things like, criminal justice kind of law enforcement tactics, but they should be educated in things like you guys are learning in this class, things like theories of crime. So that was the first goal. He wanted police officers to be much more educated. He also was someone who very strongly believed that the police departments need to not only be up on the most recent technology, but be at the cutting edge of technology. So back in the 1930s, basically what this meant for him at the beginning was making patrolling via car be business as usual, be the way that police officers patrol their areas and conduct business. And specifically patrolling using cars and using two-way radios to call in offenses, to call for backup, things like that. You guys all think of that probably as just kind of course the police do that, but back in the early 1900s, police officers primarily just walked around their beats, and Vollmer found that not only was that bad for safety reasons, but it also really kind of didn't allow the police departments to have a lot of oversight over their police officers. So the reasons for enhancing police technology were multiple. And finally, he felt that it was incredibly important for police officers to really be experts at decision making. And he wanted part of the education of these officers to be about teaching them how to use their discretion in an effective, proper, non-biased way. So managing police's use of discretion, managing police officers' decision making was something that he was very passionate about. Now, keep in mind, he didn't think that we should remove decision making from police officers, and he didn't think that they should have free rein. He wanted to teach police to make smart decisions. He really believed that it was impossible to remove all kind of decision making from a police officer's job. And instead, what he was more concerned with was making them use better judgment and be good decision makers out there in the field on a day-to-day basis. So those were essentially some of his major goals, and all of these goals were designed to enhance the professionalism and the legitimacy of the police as authority figures. This was the time period when the police, as you guys know them, really got designed, and those were some of the goals of the era. But the two pillars of this professional model, the business practices for the police that became not only thought of as essential and vital, but as important for controlling and lowering crime, were two things. First of all, it was during this time period, the 1930s to the 1980s, that we developed the idea that the police should be responders, that they should be rapid responders to incidents, specifically when a civilian calls in an offense. So this was the time period when the idea of 911, got developed, got used in this country. And the idea that the police's primary goal was to respond to and solve crimes really became part of their practice. And the second part of the professional model that became really its pillar was the idea that not only should they be responding to calls, but they should be trying to control crime through their presence on the streets, and they should be doing that through patrolling in patrol cars. So what I'm going to show you is, starting towards the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, some people out there started to think that the police maybe could be doing a better job. We had been in this professional model for the better part of the 20th century, and as you guys know now, crime during the 1970s and 1980s was going way up. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction with what the police were doing because it didn't seem like it was being incredibly effective at preventing or solving or stopping crime. So what I'm going to show you is a series of a few research experiments that came out at the time. And what's interesting about these research studies is they basically serve to knock down these pillars of the professional model and convince police officers on a large scale that they needed to be doing something different. So the first study that I'm going to talk to you about was done in Kansas City, and it was conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of police using preventive patrol. And when I say preventive patrol, I mean police officers going out with a partner. They have their beat, they have a certain amount of block area that they're expected to be responsible for, and preventively kind of slowly patrolling the neighborhood throughout their day. Sometimes parking for a little while, sometimes just driving slowly down the streets. The idea of preventive patrol, this thing that got established as part of professional policing, was you were going to create this omnipresence, that people were going to feel like the police were around any corner. Hopefully that would deter people from committing crime. So what researchers wanted to find out in the late 1970s, or early 1970s at this point, is, does this actually work? Does preventive patrol levels, if you alter them and you measure how much crime is happening, does it actually seem like patrolling matters? So in this study, they took Kansas City. They were fortunate enough to work with the police on this experiment, and they divided up Kansas City neighborhoods into 3 different experimental groups. First of all, you had a group that they called the reactive patrol group. In the reactive group, patrol cars wouldn't be necessarily patrolling the neighborhood, but if a crime was called in, they would react, they would enter into the neighborhood at that point. So in this situation, there's the least amount of police presence on a kind of an hour-by-hour basis. Then they had a neighborhood area that they called the proactive experimental group. And in the proactive group, not only were police officers patrolling the neighborhood in cars, but there were much more police officers in cars there than there normally were. So if business as usual was, 1 police car in the area, they put 3 in. That was kind of the idea. Idea being, if there are more police officers in a neighborhood, the expectation was there should be less crime in that area because people are more aware of the chance of getting caught. And then they had a control neighborhood where it was essentially just business as usual. They had the standard number of police cars that they always had. And what they wanted to do in this experiment is, over time, once you manipulate the level of police presence, does crime change? So think about what you would expect for this. I mean, hypothetically, you would expect that the reactive area would have the most amount of crime. The proactive area would have the least amount of crime, and the control area would probably be somewhere in the middle. But what they found really shocked the law enforcement community, because they found that it made absolutely no difference how much police presence you put in a neighborhood in terms of the crime that happened in the subsequent weeks and months. Not only was there no difference in the amount of crime, but people who lived in these different neighborhoods didn't report crimes any differently. And people who lived within these different neighborhoods didn't report being any more or less fearful of crime. Because you might expect, there's a lot of hypotheses you could put out there, but you might expect that people in the proactive neighborhood felt safer, that they felt that there was less fear of crime because there were more cops on the streets. That's why people want to put cops out on the streets. Well, in this experiment, it didn't matter if there was a 300% increase in the amount of cops in an area or they were completely taken away. Citizens didn't report even noticing. They asked citizens in surveys after the experiment was over, did you notice any change in the police presence in your neighborhood in the past 6 months? They said, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about. So there were no significant differences, any of these things. Citizens also didn't report being any more or less satisfied with the police. Even in the area where, even when you compare things like the reactive and the proactive group, citizens within those two neighborhoods reported being about about as satisfied as each other in terms of thinking the police are doing their jobs, doing a good job. So this experiment, you have to understand the context at the time. The Kansas City Police Department agreed to do this experiment partly because they thought that this was going to be this glowing review of how they do business. They were sure that what they were doing was effective. The idea that showing that what they were doing made absolutely no difference in all of these different ways really rocked the policing community to its core. This was a nationally published study. It got extreme amounts of attention in the law enforcement community, and it really shook people who had based their entire models of policing around this professional policing institution. So this is kind of the first example. This was the first experiment that really shook to the core and took down one of these pillars of professional policing. The second study that I want to show you is a study that got done in Newark, New Jersey a few years later by a gentleman named George Kelling. And the study is what we now call in criminology and criminal justice circles the Newark Foot Patrol experiment. So in this experiment, again, this had come after the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment. People were starting to think that, patrolling in cars it's not very effective. So what Kelling wanted to uncover was, well, maybe if we get police out of the cars, maybe that's a better way to conduct police patrol business as usual. So it was a very similar format to the patrol car experiment because he divided up neighborhoods within Newark, New Jersey into 3 different types of areas: a reactive, a proactive, and a control place. Obviously, in the reactive area, police officers aren't on foot patrol, but they go in if a situation arises. Proactive areas have lots of police officers walking around, and the control areas have about as much as they ever had. So, and really this study came about because Kelling watched foot patrol officers and became incredibly impressed by their activities on their beats in terms of the amount of just contact that they were having with the community, keeping abreast of problems, gathering information, gathering knowledge about residents. He was very impressed with that style of policing, and he wanted to see if that style of policing matters, if it's any better. So a couple things that he found. First of all, unlike the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment, residents in New York, New Jersey were very aware of the altered patrol levels. They noticed that in the proactive area, that there were a lot more police walking around. And in the area where the police were gone, they noticed. They reported, yeah, no, I haven't seen any police officers. That surprises me. Similar, however, to the Kansas City experiment, they found that crime levels are not affected by this. That even though residents seem more aware of patrolling levels, the amount of crime in different areas with more or less police patrolling on foot doesn't seem to be any different. But there were some other really positive benefits that came out of this that encouraged Kelling to try to adopt a different style of policing. And the style of policing that he tried to adopt encouraged police to pay attention to the small things, to the small signs of disorder, to the small problems in a community so that you can stop problems before they start. Because in this study, in the Newark, New Jersey Foot Patrol experiment, he found that residents reported feeling a lot safer in the communities that had a proactive and increased amount of foot patrol. And residents reported that the severity of the problems within their community were a lot less than they seemed to be before. So, in a way, it wasn't the best news because crime doesn't seem to be necessarily immediately impacted, but all of these other community level factors, neighborhood level factors, he found to be benefiting. So Kelling took this idea that focusing on the small stuff and building community relationships and targeting small level crime is effective. He took that idea and he collaborated with an author named James Q. Wilson in the paper that you read for today in the Atlantic Monthly. And then in this paper, they introduced their theory, which was the theory of broken windows.